Hi, this is Eric with BC Gurus, and this is part 8 of web forms. And this video is going to talk about customization of web forms, primarily involving customizing the HTML. And BC is pretty flexible in the sense that they allow you to do pretty much anything and everything you can think of to a form. Especially on the front end when developing the UI for the form itself. As you've seen in some of the other videos, and as we're going to dive into deeply in this, forms are just basic HTML, and the JavaScript that's included with BC's forms are generally related to the validation, and even that you can customize. A little bit of a word of warning here. All of this stuff is going to require some hand editing of the HTML. When you go down that route, it's going to create some issues for your end customers if they're the type of customers that may need to or want to edit their own forms. By hand editing the forms, you do make that a little bit more difficult. The default editing functionality, as I'll show you, stops working. You won't be able to add and remove fields without having to do some manual labor as well. But you really should feel free to experiment and try some different things. You can always reset the form back to their default settings and pretty much be guaranteed that it'll go back to working. And just again, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. You want to do things in moderation here. Add and edit and customize in ways that enhance the user experience. Don't detract from that just to be flashy. So let's talk a little bit about some of the more common customizations that we do to forms. The biggest one by far is layout. By default, the BC layout is functional, but it's pretty basic, so we often customize that. We change form labels all the time to make them more meaningful to the user. Sometimes we show and hide fields depending on certain situations. We've already talked a little bit about the amount field and some of the customizations we do there. You can completely replace the validation that BC provides. You could use something like jQuery validate if you wanted to. We might copy one field to another, for instance on a sign-up form when it asks for the user's email address and a username for that user. A lot of the times we want the user to use their email address as their username, and so when they're done filling out the email address field, we'll copy that data into the username field so that when their user is created it will be consistent there. And then you can use all sorts of custom UI widgets, sliders, special form controls. If you don't like BC's default date picker widget, you can use a number of calendar controls available out there on the internet or build your own. So those, and really again, you can do just about anything you can think of. But those are the more common ones we do. Beyond that, there are some customizations that have functionality built into BC. We'll cover those as well. Disabling the autoresponder. Sometimes you don't want that thank you email being sent to your customer for one reason or another. Disabling the double opt-in. We talked about that in the email marketing video. And then you may want to redirect the user to a specific thank you page for a form beyond just the standard system message page that BC provides for you, which would be the default. So we're going to kind of cover all of this stuff in varying amounts of detail, and but first I want to show you some examples just to give you an idea of the types of things that are possible. Alright, so the first example I'm going to show you is a donation form we built, and this is just for a non-profit, so users can select different amounts to donate, and this is kind of a user study thing. We found that providing specific options actually increases the likelihood that they'll use them and thus donate greater amounts. So you can see here we've got a radio selector where the amount is populating down here. They can come down here and try and click this field and change the value, but it won't let them. They can click the other option, and at that point it clears the field out and they can enter whatever value they want. We've done variations on this theme to where the text box for other is only shown when the other option is selected. We've got two fields down here, and this first one is what event or project is this donation for, and they can choose one of the predefined options, or again they can choose another option, and when they do that they get an additional other field down here, so they can actually type in where they'd like their donation to go. And then you can see we've kind of customized some of the layout down here as well, and that's all done with simple HTML and JavaScript. So the second example I'm showing you is an example of a checkout form we did for an e-commerce store. So this is the actual real checkout form that integrates with their store and their products, and this site sells coffee, and so that's what you're seeing here. You can see we've changed the layout quite drastically, including adding some just text, some instructions, a link to the privacy policy, and so on and so forth. I've started to fill out this form, but you can see I've filled in my billing address but not my shipping address, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier in a previous video, where if you want to provide something like this checkbox, it will go ahead and fill in this information for them, just copying it from the billing address. So that's a neat customization you can do. And then finally down here, we've actually done a couple of different things. The card expiration drop-down fields, it's currently July 2012. That's the real date when we're recording this video, and so the month is pre-selected to be that, and that doesn't mean that's when their credit card's going to expire, but it does at least put it to a currently valid date right there. And then for the security code, we've added a link down here that they can just click on, and this pop-up window comes up, kind of pointing out where the card security codes can be found and some information about that. So I'm sure you've seen something like this before in various forms. It's just what we've done on this form. So again, you can get pretty creative or not, just depending on how you want to do things. You can add extra information in here to these labels. Really, the sky's the limit. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about some basic theory for customization. Some of these specific customizations that we've made to these forms we'll make available as part of the resources section, but for the actual demos, I'm going to talk more about basic concepts, things to watch out for, and really try and keep it as basic as possible, because not everyone is incredibly familiar with HTML, and we've got to keep the length pretty reasonable here. So let's go ahead and jump into that. So we're back to our trusty test web form, and the first thing we should talk about is how you begin, really. And you've seen me in other videos customize a form by placing the raw HTML directly on a page and then making some minor customizations that way. That's certainly one way to do it, but that makes your form customizations very accessible to your customers, and depending on your customer, that might not be a good idea, simply because they have a tendency to try and change things, which could end up breaking things. So there are different ways to do that, and we generally recommend the approach I'm going to show you. And so starting from your form builder, let's go ahead and add one or two custom fields, just so we have some of those to demo as well. So we'll just call this test single line. And we'll go ahead and do that, and I think that's good enough for what we're going to do here. Actually, I am going to add our CRM form as well, because there's some information related to those that we may want to customize as well. So let's go ahead and we'll save that, and then come up to our More Actions box, and this is where you start customizing. Now there's two similar options on this. The first one is Get Web Form HTML Code, and this interface is generally not very friendly at all, but the purpose is so you can always get back to the default HTML code whenever you need to. This never changes depending, or it always reflects the current state of the form, so it'll have your form fields on there, but it's not going to reflect your actual customizations. This will always be the default layout. And it also shows you a preview. So that's where you can go to always get the default layout if you mess up. But when you're ready to actually customize the form itself, what you're going to want to use is the Customize Web Form option, and that's going to load the form into an editor where you can come to the back end and start making your changes to the HTML. And you can edit directly in here and save these changes, and when you do that, it will essentially mark the form as being customized, and at that point you can still insert the form as a module on the page as we've done here, and the form code that gets emitted to the browser will reflect what you've changed in the customized dialog box over here. Okay, so first things first, we should point out a couple of gotchas that lots of people run into. I haven't made any customizations yet besides adding custom fields, but that doesn't really count as a customization because BC can handle that just fine. So I've still got the form inserted on my page as a module, and if I preview this page, you can see my custom fields are on there just like they should be. Now I can consequently come back here and come to my more actions and open up customize web form again, and just to do something really simple, we'll just remove the title field entirely, which is totally fine. If you don't want that field on there, you can just delete it, and BC will be just very happy. No problem. So I can make that customization, and again, no changes to the actual page. We've just got the web form module on there, and I can preview this and reload it, and the title field is gone. So that at that point works pretty much just like you would expect it to. Where things can get a little tricky though is, let's say after I've made that HTML customization, if I were to come in here and start making changes, removing fields, adding different fields, I can come down here. Let's go ahead and remove those two. We'll add the phone number. We'll save this form. At this point, again, still just the module tag, but if we were to preview the page and reload it, none of those changes have been reflected. We've still got the custom fields here. We're missing the home phone field, and that's because once you've customized the field or customized the form, BC is no longer able to come in here and make adjustments to the code it uses to generate that form, and it's really a safety concern because you wouldn't want your hard customization work to be overwritten just because you added a form. So that's a point where this box, the Get Web Form HTML code, can come in handy. You can take this code out, copy and paste it into an editor that makes it a little bit easier to see, and then find those additional fields, which will be in here because this always reflects the current state of the default form. So I could take this, copy this into an editor so it's nice and spaced out, find all those special fields that I added and paste those back in to my customize box in the place I want them, and that's how you would have to go about changing the fields. That's a rather complicated workflow, which is why I say if you're going to start customizing your forms, you've got to realize that it's going to make it difficult for your site owners, your customers, to make those changes unless they're familiar with HTML. So just keep that in mind. Now, if you do find yourself in a situation you can't get out of, you've broken something and you're just not sure what to do, you can use this Restore Default button, and it's got a confirmation on it now. But that Restore Default will put the form back to its original HTML code, and it will reflect whatever forms fields you've currently got on there. I've removed those fields, which is why that's all that was there, but you can always start adding the fields back to it that you need, and restore it to defaults, and it will give you the default layout and coding again for that. So it's easy to recover. It's always a good idea to maybe copy your custom code into Notepad or some other text editor that you can save. That way you can safely make changes to your form and test it. So just keep those types of things in mind. So I'm going to go ahead and add a few more custom fields back here, and we'll dive into some of the work you can actually do to make some of these changes. Alright, so let's get to doing some real customization work. Just so you know what's going on, we're back to our form with our single custom field. It's a single line text form, and then we have a CRM form, which is a different type of custom field, and that has two options as part of that form. And we're going to show these both because when you're working with HTML, they have a slightly different syntax, just regular old custom fields versus CRM custom fields versus built-in standard fields. Let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and add one other field, say the home phone, to this guy as well, so you can see that. Alright, so I'm going to walk you through a workflow that we generally like to use when it comes to customizing a web form. And the reason we do this is a lot of our customization work involves JavaScript, and it all involves hand editing HTML. And trying to do that on the back end is certainly possible, and you can do it if you're in a bind or just making a simple change. But it's much easier to use a more fully featured HTML editor. And we're going to use Dreamweaver for this, although you can use pretty much any HTML editor that can connect to an FTP site, because BC exposes all of this over FTP. So I'm going to come in here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy the form code out of this box, and then I'm going to come over to my actual page, and I've got that loaded up here. We're going to use our test page that we created earlier, and we still got the module tag on here, but to just kind of speed things along when it comes to making small changes and quickly previewing them, we're going to paste our HTML code into this form, or into the page, and we're going to save that. And at that point, we're going to be able to edit this page over an FTP connection, make changes, and rapidly save it, and we'll be able to just come back to our test page and refresh it. When we're done and we're satisfied with the layout of the form, we can just come in here and copy the HTML back into the web form editor over here and save it, and that will allow us to continue using the module tag, which is what we prefer to do. So let's go ahead and switch over to Dreamweaver real quick and load this up. Alright, so we've got Dreamweaver open and connected to our site. We've loaded up our test page over here, and this is just done over plain old FTP. We're not even using the Dreamweaver extension for Business Catalyst. It works similar, but FTP is universal. So that's what we're going to use. And I want to start by kind of explaining the default HTML structure, because it helps to get a handle on it. You've got a form tag up here, and the bottom of the form always ends with this form tag. It doesn't have to work exactly like that. You can include additional HTML code outside of this, but this is what you get by default. At the bottom of the form, you have this block of JavaScript, and we'll deal with this a little later, but this is the code that's validating the form, making sure the required fields are present and filled in. And we also have this script tag, which is what BC includes. It's kind of its validation library where all of its functions for actually checking for empty fields and things like that live, and so that's always going to be right above there. The form itself, underneath the form tag, we've got the span element that just is an indicator to the end user. It's got an asterisk in there. It's got this class on it that makes it red, and it's just indicating that fields with the asterisk have the required indicator next to them. That's what that means. And then all of the form fields exist inside a single table, and it's got a table body, and then inside the table body, each field consists of a single row and a single cell. So we've got one row, and that row has one cell, and inside the field, the actual label for the form is just a label element with an attribute that links it up with the actual input field. BR to make the form field go down to the next line underneath the label, and then we have the actual input field itself. In this case, it is a select field. The single text fields are just going to have a single input type text on them. Again, table row, table cell, form label. Now on the required fields for the form label, right next to it, inside the label tag, you're going to have a span, and with that asterisk on there, and then again it's going to show up with red. So that's the overall layout of the form itself. So let's go ahead and delete the title field. That's generally one of the first things we do, because to us it's just not an important field to collect, and so we don't want it on our form. Now then we can save our changes and let Dreamweaver upload those to the server. And at that point, it's very easy to switch back to our browser, reload the page, and as you can see, the title field is gone. So that's kind of why we like this workflow. It just makes things really easy. Let's go ahead and talk about changing field labels. That's something that's pretty common. So again, the field label is just the label element inside of the table cell, which is the TD element. So we can come in here and change the text of this. We could just call this name, and that wouldn't make sense really, but that's this is just for a demo here. You don't want to change the 4 over here, because this 4 is supposed to match up with the ID of the field, and that's kind of a user interface trick which will allow the field to become selected when they actually click on the label. Instead of clicking inside the box, I can just click on the label itself and it will focus the field, and that's what that 4 attribute is used for, and that's why it needs to match the ID of the field. Now that brings us to an important distinction. Each one of the input fields on the form has 2 characteristics. It's going to have an ID attribute and a name attribute. Now, the ID attribute isn't really used by Business Catalyst. It's there so you can easily target this with JavaScript, and it's just really proper to have it, but it doesn't actually make any difference. The name element, however, or the name attribute, is incredibly important. This name over here is what BC is going to look for when the user submits the form, so it knows that this field up here is the first name field and this field is the last name field. So the name field absolutely must be correct, and it must be present. If you don't include the name field, that data won't even be sent to Business Catalyst. Now, the built-in CRM fields like first name, last name, email, and consequently home phone number, and I'm going to go ahead and cut this and move this underneath the email so that we've got all our CRM fields linked together. And let's undo that. But anyways, you can see the built-in CRM fields all have a name that's very easy to understand. We've got email, home phone, first, last name, very self-explanatory. When it comes to our basic custom fields that you would add to a form, they have a very unfriendly name attribute, and it's always going to be capital CAT followed by underscore custom followed by this number, and this number is some sort of a field ID that BC uses to track this in the database. So this number is important, and it's specific to this field. And if you were to create another custom field on another form called my custom text field, it would look similar, but it would have a different number here. So that's one of the mistakes that people often make when they start working with this. You'll try and copy some of your fields from one form to the other, and if you do that with fields such as first, last, and email, it'll be fine, because the email address is always has a name of email address. But the custom fields will always have a unique value here that's specific to this field on this form. CRM custom fields are similar in nature to plain old custom fields, but they have an even different format. Now, this was a regular custom field. It's cat custom number. CRM custom fields include additional information. They start with cat custom, and then they have the field ID, which is the first number, and then they have the form ID, which is the second number. And that can be useful when you're trying to do some manual edits and you're not exactly sure what these are supposed to be. You can get these numbers out of the admin area by looking at the URL and in various other places. So just know that this is the field ID and this is the form ID. So that's kind of what CRM custom fields look like. So you've already seen me customize the name label up here. You've also seen me move the home phone number up, and that's simply a matter of copying and pasting. Pretty straightforward so far. Something else that's pretty common, we often remove this span class required, and just because it's kind of unnecessary, and we generally provide our own user interface element for that. But something that'll be a little useful to show you how relatively easy it is to kind of do some layout changes and make this form a little bit more friendly looking. Let's go ahead and group these fields so that we've got one section of the form that shows our CRM fields, another section that shows our custom field, and then we'll have one other section that shows our CRM custom fields. So I'll do this once by hand and then just kind of auto do it to the rest of them. I want to give you a chance to see what's going on. So I'm going to come down below my home phone number, and I'm going to go ahead and close the table body tag as well as the opening table tag. So now we've got this single table, and we're going to go ahead and put an H2 element, and we'll call these CRM fields. Actually, we'll call these contact fields. That's a little more accurate. And then we'll close the H2. And then I'm just going to copy these two table lines and come down under the closing table tag and create another table there. And I'm going to create another field label and just place that in between the two tables, and we'll call this label custom fields. And there's only one of them. So I'm going to take this whole section again, and I'm going to do a copy, and I'm going to actually first I've got to again close out the table body and the table, and then I can paste in my third table, and we'll call this guy custom CRM fields. And that just gives us some separation. So now instead of just having one gigantic table with everything, we've got some labels up here, and we have three different tables. We've got one for the contact fields, one for the custom field, and one for there was the custom field, and then one for the CRM fields. And then we can just take advantage of the closing table body and a table tag that was already on there for our third table. So let's go ahead and save this out and make sure we haven't broken anything too horribly. So we'll save that and then switch back to our browser and reload our page up here. And as you can see, we've now made some relatively simple changes, and while I wouldn't make a form with these types of labels, it does provide some separation and some user friendliness when filling out the form. So that's some basic stuff you can do. Alright, so now you don't have to use tables. That's just the default that BC gives you. Some people like using divs. That's fine. You can switch to field sets. It really doesn't matter. You can use any HTML you want for the most part. But again, just keep in mind that your input fields need to have the correct name. Otherwise, BC isn't going to know what this field is being used for. So that's very important. So now the next thing we're going to do is talk about customizing JavaScript. And we're just going to cover some very basic workflow type things. And this comes in handy because a lot of times you're going to have to make changes in here to get some more advanced functionality on the form. Now, before we get too far into it, let's go ahead and do something that just needs to be done. This is just one big JavaScript blob, and it's kind of hard to read and see what's going on. So we're going to copy this code out, and we're going to format it using a website called JS Beautifier. So let's go ahead and site up. It's you can get to the site by going to jsbeautifier.org, and it looks a little complicated, but it's very simple. Just click in the box, paste in your code, and click Beautify JavaScript or HTML, and it will come through here. And it's not going to change any of the code, it's just going to format it so you can actually read it and work with it. And I'll show you why this is important when we get back into Dreamweaver. So we want to come back and paste this back in, and now we have a much more legible and useful set of JavaScript on here. Now, I'm going to point out some things. What we have here is the validation function that runs when the form is submitted. So all this code is what's determining whether the form is filled out correctly. And I'll leave that to you to decipher the JavaScript. It's pretty straightforward when you look at it. But the important part, and this is something that gets people all the time, even if they're not really trying to customize the form, this can happen accidentally when you're working with the BC backend. But this is a function, and it's the function that runs to validate the form, and it has a name, check hull form 79305. Now, this number isn't really important, but it's just part of what BC generates when it creates form code. You can really call this function anything you want, but it's reasonable to leave it the default. What gets people is, for some reason, this number sometimes gets out of sync with this number. Right now they're the same, but sometimes things can happen where that gets changed. So those should match, and that number should also match this line in here, and the number in this line in here. More importantly than anything, though, this entire text from check to 5 must match perfectly at the very top of the form with this line right here. This is the most common problem. This gets changed, but it doesn't get changed down here, and when that happens, none of your validation code will run. And that means that people are going to click the form with invalid data or missing data, and BC is going to try and submit the form, and they're going to get a very unfriendly error code. And I'll show you what that looks like. If we were to just change this to a 6 and not change any of these other values, we'll save the form and then reload our test page, and I'll show you what happens when that form gets submitted. So we're going to click submit, and in this case we're just going to get this very ugly error saying you didn't even capture the email and customer name, and that's because your form code that validated the form didn't run. So the simple fix there is just make this one at the top match with the one at the bottom. That number also comes in over here as well. It's not really important, but it might as well match. Now, the second error that people who customize forms often run into is getting the wrong data in here. So this part after the form process to .aspx is the ID of the form. This is how BC knows what form you're submitting, and it's based on this number. So let's change this to something that doesn't exist, like 70777, and if we were to save this again and come back over to our test page, and we'll go back, reload this guy, and this time when we submit the form, we've got our validation on there again. So let's go ahead and provide some values, and we'll let that fill out. Test, and item 2. Click submit, and now we get this this message that comes up all the time. We see this on the forums in all sorts of places, but it says you have deleted your web form. It's telling you to go into your admin panel, reset the form, and put it back on the page. You can certainly do that, but when you see that option, that generally means that Business Catalyst doesn't know what form you're trying to submit, so you need to come back here and change that back to the value it was originally set to. If you don't know what that value is supposed to be set to, you can find that in the admin section of the site. Let's go back to our web form. And you can see right here on the form builder, the last part of the URL is 30070, and that is the value of the form, and that's what's supposed to be in here. So that covers some basic customizations. It gets you started with changing some layout and some things to look out for, mostly problems that we find people running into quite often, and that's really how we get started with this. So just a couple more basic customizations I want to run through with you. The first one is rather handy, and you can do some pretty neat things with it, and that is to pre-populate some of these values. Now, the way you do that is by placing the value attribute, which will provide a default value for an input field, and then inside of that attribute you use the module syntax to fill in the customer's first name. And so that's what it looks like for first name, and you can do the same thing by adding a value for the last name and the email address, and so on and so forth. Now, there's a couple things you need to be aware of. At least right now, these don't work unless they're all lowercase. A lot of times BC doesn't care about the casing, but for these, they don't work unless they're all lowercase. And you can do that with email address and home phone. If you don't know exactly what they should be, there's a reference page on BC Gurus. Sorry, not on BC Gurus, but on the Business Catalyst forums that provides you with a list of what you can use here. So we'll provide that link as part of the resources that come with this video. You can do the same thing with CRM custom fields as well, and that's kind of where I was talking about the field ID versus the form ID. What you're going to want to do, the syntax for these look a little different. So if we were to come in here and do value equals, the way this field is supposed to look is module underscore customer field, comma, and then you need to specify the form ID and the field ID. Now, it's exactly the opposite of the way it's spelled out in here. In here, this is the field ID, and that's the form ID. In the module tag itself, you actually do the form ID followed by the field ID, and there's a comma in between those. So that's a little bit different syntax than you're used to, but it's the same basic concept. Now, none of this information will actually work, first name, last name, none of this will be filled out unless the customer is currently logged into your site. We talk a little bit more about that in our Secure Zones video, but the basic idea is if you've got a returning customer and they've actually gone through the process of logging into your website, then these module tags will become active and pre-fill the form out. They can still change the value when they fill the form to update it, but it will start with the current value that you know about the customer. Now, if someone has that logged in, but for whatever reason you don't have the information, so you don't have their first name on file or their home phone on file, it'll just be a blank form field like you would normally expect on a form. So it won't hurt anything to include those on there. The last couple things I want to talk about are some customizations you can make up here. Now, this action attribute, which is wrapping over to the next line, it's really on one line, but Dreamweaver wraps it for you. It's got a bunch of weird looking stuff in here, some tags as well. This is helping BC figure out what this form is. We've already talked about the form ID, but there's some special things you can add to this form to alter the behavior. The first thing, and we've already shown this in another video, is add the opt-in value. So it's just ampersand opt-in equals true, and that would disable the double opt-in system if you were subscribing the user to an email marketing list. The other thing, and you can mix and match these as much as you want, you can disable the autoresponder by adding another ampersand and then SAR, which stands for send autoresponder, SAR. So SAR equals false, and that will make the form not submit the autoresponder. And then finally, we'll go ahead and add another ampersand, and we'll use what's called page ID equals. And at this point, in most cases, you can do something like this. And what that does is cause the thank you page to become a specific thank you page on your site. So you can basically redirect the user to the page at this URL, and that way you don't have to use the built-in system message page. Now, sometimes you're required to actually put in the numerical page ID, and the easiest way to figure out when you can use one or the other is by testing it and seeing if it works. If one doesn't work, use the other. And if you ever need to figure out what the page ID is for your specific page, you can get that by going to the pages section of the site and simply loading up the page itself, and the last part of this URL is going to be the page ID, so you can fill that in that way. Last thing we need to do once we've got our form working and set up how we want is to just select all the text, and this time we're going to copy it back into the web form builder because we want kind of a permanent record of this stuff, and we want this to be where the real code for the form is actually stored. You can certainly put it on the page if you want, it'll work just fine, but we prefer to have it back here kind of in a predefined spot that we always know about. So that's it for this video.